That means that Jesus was 40 times more likely to ask a question than he was to give a direct answer. And here's the interesting thing. Jesus asked over 300. He was asked over 180 questions, and he only directly answered 5 of them.
You're listening to the Faith and Work Podcast, where we explore ways to serve God and others in our daily work to bring life and hope to workplaces and cities.
Welcome to the Faith and Work Podcast. My name is Ross Chapman. I serve as your host today, and I have the honor of being the CEO at Denver Institute for Faith and Work. I'm really excited about our episode today. We are taking a break from our Voices from the Workplace series to bring you a special conversation with J.R. Briggs. He is the author of the book, The Art of Asking Better Questions. And you are going to become a person of questionable influence if you listen well, check out this book, and just go on the journey of what does it mean to ask better questions. And you might be wondering yourself, like, why would the Faith and Work Podcast have this conversation about asking better questions? And I just want to tell you up front, it's because we want you to grow in your imagination for how a right view of God's vision for work actually shows up in your everyday responsibilities, in your role, in your relationships. And I think learning to ask better questions is going to help with your imagination. So I hope that you'll just listen in, understand better how important it is to consider the questions we're asking that we maybe don't even voice because we have given ourselves answers to them, and how to dream up new questions. So this is a great conversation. I'm really excited for it. You're going to enjoy it. Let me tell you a little bit about JR. JR Briggs is the founder of Kairos Partnerships, which is committed to serving leaders through coaching, consulting, and speaking. He serves on the staff with the Ecclesia Network and Fresh Expressions, and he's a frequent speaker and guest lecturer all over the country. And he's written other books. A few of them include The Sacred Overlap, Fail, and Eldership in the Mission of God. He is living with his wife and 2 kids in the greater Philadelphia area. J.R. Briggs, welcome to the Faith and Work Podcast.
Thanks, Ross. It's good to be with you.
Well, I'm really, really excited to talk to you today about this book. I actually read it yesterday, and I read it all in whole sitting. And you said in the book not to do that. So I apologize for not being a great student of the book necessarily, because now I need to go apply a lot of things.
You are a rebel.
I know, totally. But yeah, the book is called The Art of Asking Better Questions, Pursuing Stronger Relationships, Healthier Leadership, and Deeper Faith. So first question is, you're arguing that a lot of us just aren't really good at asking questions. Why is that? Why are we not better than we are at asking questions? What's getting in the way of that?
Yeah, there are lots of obstacles, Ross, and it's a great question. It's something that I really wanted to hone in on my research on that. But the number one thing is we live in a culture that doesn't really encourage questions. We live in an attention-seeking age, right? And there's a sociologist named Charles Derber who says that we are caught in conversational narcissism. And the joke goes, enough about me. What do you think about me? And so all the arrows are kind of pointing in on us as opposed to pointing out toward other people. We also fall into the trap of expertise. We think we already know. It's perceived inefficiency, right? We got things to do. We got decisions to make and sales to close. Don't ask questions is going to slow it down. It's also not modeled very well. It's just poor modeling that we have, and it requires a lot of deliberate practice. So you stack all of those obstacles on top of each other, in addition to things of people saying, I don't know what I'm going to learn. I'm kind of afraid to hear the answer sometimes. So you stack all of these obstacles on top of each other, and what happens in a culture of efficiency and progress and a culture of self-centeredness, questions are low on the priority list.
Yeah. Well, I think that sounds exactly how I experience life today. So if I was interested in maybe not just asking more questions, but asking better questions, is that a matter of just being more interested in others? Is it, you talk a lot about curiosity, but what are some of the factors that you would say, like, what makes a better question?
Yeah. Well, when we get down to it, what is the point of a question? Well, I love what Heather Holleman talked about. She's a professor at Penn State. She said questions are essentially for clarity or engagement. I might use the word connection. Clarity, I need information. connection. That's how relationships work. And so oftentimes when we think about this, that there are 4 essentials to asking really good questions. You mentioned one, you've got to be curious. If we're not curious and people say, just give me the tips and the tricks, people can figure out that you actually don't care. You just are trying to maybe use questions as a form of manipulation. So you've got to start with curiosity, genuinely care about wanting to know more. So curiosity, but we also need wisdom, because there's a 1,000 questions we could ask. How do we know what's the right question at the right time to the right person for the right reason? And so it takes a lot of wisdom to navigate through that. But we also need humility, because when we ask a question, much of the time we don't know the answer. So when we ask a question, it's as if we're saying, I don't know. And that takes humility, which also requires the 4th thing, and that's courage. Courage to admit, I don't know. You got to help me here. So I think if we have curiosity, wisdom, humility, and courage, when those 4 things stack up, we get an opportunity to be ready to ask great questions. And the whole point of it is this, that the quality of your life will be determined by the quality of the questions that you ask God, yourself, and others. People have said to me, in one sentence, what's the book? That's it. The quality of your life will be determined by the quality of the questions you ask God, yourself, and others. And it's a statement I'm growing more and more convinced of. If we have that and believe that to our core, then we can learn the art of asking better questions. But we've got to be convinced of the power of questions to start to want to learn how to ask them better.
Yeah, as I was reading, I remember reading those 4 qualities that are necessary for asking better questions. And I thought those seem exactly right. And they're also so related to our own formation into becoming more like Jesus. I mean, first you just said you have to care. Yeah. Well, there could be a lot of inner work there to actually start to care, to be curious about others, and to see them as, something amazing, someone that's got so much richness to share with us. That feels like it's rooted in a core conviction, a little bit. You got to have something you're hanging on to that's pretty deep, for you to really want to care. Is that true? Have you found that in your journey of asking better questions?
Absolutely. And we tend to think about questions as information gathering. And what I tell people is, look, if you want information, just Google it. ChatGPT is just fine. Just use Gemini, you'll be good. But what we're after is depth and connection and trust and meaning and all the things that make us human. And so asking better questions has the power and the potential to improve the quality of every single area of our lives: relationships, career, faith, your future. It can have a significant impact on neighborhoods and schools and workplaces and churches, even online. And so that's why I'm so convinced of this. I'm convinced there's never been a better time than now in modern history when genuine, thoughtful, caring question asking is needed. And in our world that's saturated with ever increasing loneliness and division and polarization and all that comes with it, genuine question asking can provide that healing and trust and connection like almost nothing else.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is if you want to start asking better questions, this is a great tool. I actually really enjoyed the whole book, but at the very back, you got really, really practical. And I just want to give listeners a taste of what they could expect if they pick up your book. You talk about next level questions, and I'm going to just read a couple of examples. Instead of asking, how are you, to somebody, you could say, what's been the most interesting part of your day this far? You could, instead of saying, how was your vacation? You could say, what was the most exciting experience or meaningful memory from your recent vacation? How was your Father's Day? What's the most meaningful part about being a father? And they're literally what you just said. They're a deeper connection kind of question. You're not seeking an information answer. You're seeking a deeper relationship. One of the 5 guiding principles we have at Denver Institute is to embrace relationships. And I think this is so needed. And there's such clarity that you're providing people in how you can level up your questions. So definitely worth reading this book. I want to pivot, JR, for you. You've talked about the book a lot of places. So on this podcast, we want to ask you to apply some of your great studying and researching on questions and the internal work you've done to people's everyday work. So my first question for you on that is, what kind of bad, shallow questions from your vantage point have shaped how the modern Christian imagines work?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a fantastic question. And I'm not just saying that. I really am so grateful for the Institute and you leading the Institute to force us to think through this in the best possible way. I think where it gets us in trouble is when we ask questions of bifurcation, of thinking, I've got my Sunday life and my work life. And so if we begin to ask questions that are bifurcated, we're already living in a fragmented mindset that Jesus never intended us to live in. And so that would be the first one, is shallow questions of bifurcation. Number two is when we ask questions where the metrics of success don't match with the metrics of the kingdom. I love what Wendell Berry said. He said, don't work for Friday or for retirement. And I just love that. Don't work for the weekend. I think that's what it is. Don't work for the weekend or for retirement. That can we live and work in meaningful ways? It may not always be fun or preferential, but can we ask questions that connect us to goodness? How is my work a form of worship? Can be a great one. I'm sort of asking the foil, what's a better question?
Yeah.
How is my work as a form of worship? How am I bringing goodness into the world? I think if we can ask that, like the deeper levels and questions of wisdom, rather than what do I need to do to advance in my career? What do I need to do to make more money? Those are some of the shallow ones that I think our culture is willing to ask. Or do I need to quit my job so I can keep advancing up the corporate ladder? But I think the big one is every one of us has to wrestle with, what is success, quote unquote, success look like in our places of work? Because how you define success will always define you. How you define success in your organization, your nonprofit, your corporation, your school will always define your organization, nonprofit, corporation, or school. And so I think if we're asking questions of meaning, purpose, goodness, flourishing in the world, those are the best kinds of questions. But if we're asking sort of pedestrian questions of what does it take to get to the weekend, how do I advance in my career, that's where we're going to struggle.
Yeah, or how do I do just enough to get by to keep this job?
Great.
There's the whole idea of quiet quitting is
Yes.
the question is that, it's got this bad question behind it potentially. I think there's that. I think I would say we've helped Christians ask questions like, how can I do the right thing at work? How can I evangelize at work? And those are good questions. But if they stop there, they start to shape our view of work as basically instrumental or just a place I'm supposed to be a good person. It doesn't help us imagine how God's vision for work might show up in the things we do every day. I think that's so good. Well, let's keep.
I love that. Can I interrupt and keep going? You've been in this a long time and worked with lots of different leaders across various sectors. What are some of the other good questions that you wish every Christian would be asking in their workplace?
Oh, it's so good. I think one that I've tried to ask along my journey and somewhere early on in my career, the success question, reframing success as faithfulness. Doesn't give you answers immediately, but if my question isn't, what do I have to do to be successful, but what does faithfulness look like when I show up at work? Then it helps me reframe, am I working for a boss? Yes. But I am also working with God for the benefit of others. And He, I have to believe, has put me in a certain place, doing a certain role, at least for now, even if it's not forever. And so the question ought to be, what does He require of me in this role? What might I uniquely bring to my workplace that others won't, because I am trying to ask these kind of questions and trying to follow Jesus in this way. I think that leads to a greater imagination for the relationships, responsibilities, and roles that we have in our work. I think that's really important. I love what you said about essentially we would say like a sacred secular divide. You're bifurcating my Sunday life and my work life. So the question is, how can I be a good Christian on the weekend and then do really good work in the work week so that I can support the really important work through my paycheck or through my volunteer hours. And that is framing, the questions are being framed in such a way that bifurcates our lives, rather than saying, what would it look like if I integrated Jesus as Lord of my life in every area of my life? What would that mean for my workplace? And I think those are good. I think another one that we've answered that need to re-ask would be like, what is ministry? What is work? We're not really just talking about paid work. We're talking about all kinds of work. You know, what does it mean to be human and work? There's some great questions. That's what this podcast is about, right? We want to cultivate a renewed imagination for work, and that's why I love this book. It's like, you can't do that if you don't ask new questions, if you don't ask, or if you don't investigate the questions that you're asking. That's maybe one of the key takeaways I thought from this book was, how do I investigate the questions I haven't voiced, but I'm actually answering? And I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. Ross, can I ask you one more question? I guess I just did, but I wonder if I could ask you another one. If Christians didn't ask the kind of questions that you're pushing us to ask, and we just stayed in the shallow end of the pool on those questions, what would that mean, not just for us as Christian witness, but what would that mean in terms of the implication across all sectors of work if we stayed in that shallow end?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think it's been answered throughout history in some ways. You know, there's this thing called the Protestant work ethic that was an answer to a question at some point. And I think there's a lot of good in that. And there's also, it can go too far and your work kind of becomes the master of your life. But if we don't start to ask these questions, if we don't stay with these questions, I think societally what will happen is that work is a necessary evil. And it is simply something that I try to do less and less and less and less of. It could be that if we don't have an imagination for new kinds of questions and an evaluation of the current ones we have, it can also just continue to we can make work an idol. And so I have to find the right job because I've associated my calling and identity with the kind of work I get to do. You know, we've said many times on this podcast, that's not how the Bible uses calling. You are called to be in Christ and to participate with him in his mission. There is no specific job where you're not trying to do that. You're trying to live out that identity. So, you know, that's a big one. Societally speaking, if we don't do this, people are they're not going to do their job as well as they could. They're not going to be innovative. They're not going to be striving for greater competence. They're not going to be recognizing that actually my job serves society, humanity, my neighbor in some way. And so I want to actually do it with greater care and concern. It kind of makes work completely instrumental in a bad way, in the sense of like, it's just the way we've set up society. I have to work. But we know, first thing God tells us about himself is he's a worker. So, yeah, I think we could keep going on that, JR. It's a good question. I appreciate that.
Thanks for articulating that. Yeah, that was great.
I usually don't get interviewed when I'm interviewing the guests. So this is wonderful and to be expected considering the topic we're on. So I appreciate that.
Hey, I'm Luke.
And I'm Samantha.
And we're donors to Denver Institute for Faith and Work.
As entrepreneurs, our work can often feel all-consuming. The Denver Institute for Faith and Work has helped us to think both critically and theologically about how our business is impacting our workers and the communities we are a part of.
As Denver Institute pursues its mission to prepare people to serve God and others through their daily work, we look forward to the impact it'll have. This can't happen without the support of this community. If you've been encouraged by this conversation, or if your life has been shaped by Denver Institute, we encourage you to join us in giving to this mission.
To learn more or to make a financial gift, please visit the Give page at denverinstitute.org.
Okay, so one of the things that we're trying to do at Denver Institute and in the Faith and Work conversation is help people see that work's a primary arena for formation and for mission. What kind of questions come to mind for you that might help us pay attention to how work is actually shaping us? It's forming us, how work is an opportunity to join with what God's doing in the world. What comes to your mind?
Yeah. Well, I always go back to the question of what is my motive? In whatever field I'm in, what is my motive? And then also we talk about, identity, and our identity is in Christ, and we say that, but we throw around that term servant leadership a lot. And I talked about this in the book. I had a mentor in Colorado Springs, and he said to me, Jared, we hear about servant leadership, but is it better to be a servant who leads or a leader who serves? And I thought, first I thought, well, this is just nuance. It's just semantics. And he said, no, there's a big difference. I would give you a week to think about it. And I'll meet you at Chipotle next week and let's talk about it. And I said, I think that we're supposed to be a servant who leads rather than a leader who serves, but I'm not exactly sure why. And he was able to articulate it. He said, look, if you're a leader in whatever field, whatever sector you're in, and you're taken out of the role of leadership, it's going to crush you because that was your identity. But if you're a servant and that's your identity, you're a servant who leads, you're taken out of a leadership role and you're put in a role that doesn't require leadership or doesn't have a title. You're now a servant who serves, who plunges toilets or makes deliveries around town or whatever it might be. He said, you're still rooted in your identity. It's just that the expression changes. And so I think that's a really important question for us. And I know not all of us on this podcast are necessarily leaders, maybe in an official term, but I think we all are lowercase L leaders. So as servant leaders, are we leaders who serve, or are we servants who lead? I think is a very important question for us to ask, because that's not nuance. That will shape how we view our work in very significant ways. And with that comes I'm wrestling with this myself, and it's been very convicting. And if I can be a bit vulnerable here for a moment, and they say, if you want to know if you're a servant or not, see how you react when you're treated like one. And there have been some moments over the last few months where I've been treated like a servant and have not responded well. And I thought, I have a ways to go and a ways to grow. Because if I truly am a servant and I'm treated like one, then I wouldn't have just responded the way I did. And so what does that mean? It doesn't mean we're a doormat, but what does that mean for us to actually show up every day? I love what Simon Sinek says. He said, every time I give a speech, people say, you're one of the most sought after speakers in the world. Why in the world? Now, I don't think he's a person of faith, at least not a person of Jesus' faith that I'm aware of. But he said, before I get up to speak, and people have said, why are you so sought after? There's a lot of good speakers, but why you? He said, I don't know, but I have a guess. And he said, when I get up to speak, I'm introduced, people are clapping, I step to the stage. He said, under my breath, I say, I am here to serve. They're not here to tell me I'm so great. I am here to serve. And that's been something I've actually stolen, Ross, that when I'm speaking somewhere or presenting or teaching, right after the introduction, no one hears it before the lavalier is clicked on. I always say, I am here to serve. And I think if we can be the kind of people that show up every day to work to say, what is my motive? If I'm here to serve, how can I serve and who can I serve? And one of my favorite questions, how can I add value to the person or persons in front of me? And that value may be listening. It may be providing financial documentation that we need in our jobs, or teaching students well, or coming prepared and ready to discuss a product launch, whatever it might be. But how can I add value to the person or persons who are in front of me? I think that is one of the best ways that we can live out jobs of excellence, of meaning and purpose, and creates connection and values other people when we add value to them.
I love that. I think that's a great question we could ask ourselves when we enter our workplaces each day. How am I serving others? How can I add value to the people around me, whether it's clients or coworkers, your supervisors, vendors? Yeah, that's awesome, JR. Let's focus a little attention on Jesus's asking and how he received questions. I can tell you spent quite a bit of time looking into this. Just tell us what you learned from like a survey level. Like, how many questions did Jesus ask? How many times did people ask him questions?
Yeah, I love this topic, Ross, because there are many of us on this podcast that are followers of Jesus. And what's interesting as followers of Jesus, we study his teachings, we study his miracles, we study his parables, but very seldom do we ever study his questions, what he asked, who he asked, where he asked it. And yet there was so much life change and life transformation that happened on the other side of his questions. And so I really live by the conviction that if we're going to be followers of Jesus, we better learn to live like him, which includes learning how he asks questions. And so I live by that really strong conviction in that. One of the interesting things I did, and this was part of my doctoral dissertation, was actually doing a deep dive of teaching leaders how to ask questions in the way of Jesus. And it was fascinating going into that. And one of the things that I found is I started with a red letter edition of the Bible. And I just circled every red question mark that I found throughout the New Testament. The 4 Gospels and 1 in Acts. Don't forget the 1 in Acts. And I just was amazed. Here's Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, right? If anybody had the right to never ask a question, it would be Jesus. To say, look, I got 33 years, only 3 years of my ministry, so 1/11 of my life, I'm going to go into public ministry. Okay, now you guys sit down and shut up, and I'm going to tell you. Take some good notes, and I'm just going to tell you truth, 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 truth. And he did that, but so much of what he did was asking questions. And here's what I found. His first recorded words in the Gospels was not 1 question. There were 2 questions to his parents. When they said, where were you? We lost you for 3 days. He was in the temple. He said, didn't you know I'd be in my Father's house? Where else did you think I would be? His final words on the cross were a question. My God, why have you forsaken me? Even after Easter, after the resurrection, he continues asking questions, including one of my favorites, do you have anything to eat? And that's a deep theological question, by the way, because after the resurrection, people thought Jesus was a ghost. Well, ghosts don't eat food. And it was just one of the ways to be able to say, I'm actually flesh and blood right here with you. So all that to say, here's the fun stats. The people love these stats. There's no way to tell the exact number because translating from Greek to English, we can't always tell, is that an exclamation point? Is that a question? We sometimes lose it in the cultural nuance. But we can say with certainty that Jesus asked over 300 questions throughout the New Testament. If you just did the NIV, there would be 325 questions that you could find there. But we just know Greek to English, over 300 questions. That means that Jesus was 40 times more likely to ask a question than he was to give a direct answer. And here's the interesting thing. Jesus asked over 300. He was asked over 180 questions, and he only directly answered 5 of them. 4 of them indirectly, and the rest of them he either ignored, told a story, asked another question back. But that to me was the most mind-blowing of all of them, that Jesus only directly answered 5 questions that were directed toward him.
Yeah. And if you want to know those 5, you should pick up the book because you explain a little bit of those direct answers, which seem more weighty when you say there's only 5 times. But yeah, the point you're making being like, he asked a lot, he was asked a bunch, he wasn't giving just a bunch of answers. What does that tell you, JR? Like, what should we take away from that?
Yeah. Well, here's the cool thing. Let me back up a little bit because neuroscience on this is really fun. And one of the things they found is that when people are, and they put nodes all over and do MRI scans and things like that, when people are given information, their brains light up. But one of the things they found is when someone is asked a question, your brain fires and explodes with synapses and neurons everywhere like fireworks are going off. As we know, we learn best not when people are just giving us information and we're passively writing down notes. It's when people are asking questions and saying, what do you think? And you go, I got to think about that. And so it forces us to participate. Jesus knew all the neuroscience of all this. So what does it do? It makes us more alive when people are asking us questions. It forces us to be a participant. Jesus wanted us to participate in life, not be a passive spectator. And one of his most common questions he asked was, what do you think? It's one of the more common questions in the Gospels. What do you think? Jesus really cared out of connection, but also wanting to draw people in to challenge them and to participate in this idea of faith and life. And so he did that for honor and dignity. He did that to show redemption and compassion. He could reframe and challenge assumptions by asking questions. He revealed what's really on people's hearts, their true desires. And the truth is, he actually is modeling the heart of the Father. Jesus said, I never do anything unless I see my Father doing it. Well, we're just talking about the New Testament, but God the Father, the first member of the Trinity, he asked a ton of questions in the Old Testament as well. And so here's the all-knowing God of the universe who still asks questions too. So there's a lot of layers as to why Jesus would do that. A lot of people get confused. Wait, Jesus was asked a question. Why did he ask a question back? That's sort of weird in our, Q&A type world. But as a first century rabbi in Eastern mindset, he was answering the question. He just answered it through another question. And if you think about it enough, he actually was giving a good answer oftentimes. And so it's rabbinical training. You ask a question and you follow up with another question. So anyway, there's a lot of layers there, and this is probably more than you were hoping, but there's so many reasons why Jesus asked questions. And I'm so glad he did, because even those questions now challenge us as the reader 2,000 years later to wrestle with some of these questions that were intended for some other primary audience, but we're overhearing, and we're the secondary audience of going, how would I answer that? And that's the brilliance of questions, of which Jesus knew all along. The synapses in our brain are firing even as we read the Gospels.
Well, I really thought all that was super fascinating. And the what do you think question, I think there's sometimes we've gotten the impression, whether through church or through life or something, that, God should just give us the answers. Like, I wish he'd just write it in the sky, or, zap it to me somehow, or I'm going to pray about this until he tells me. And I think in my imagination, I love him sitting there asking me across the table, what do you think? Because he gave us a brain. He gave us a mind. He wants us to go through the thought process. He wants the relational connection. And I think that should give us a sense of freedom and confidence. Well, what do I actually think about it? And maybe I should take a step towards that and then ask another question, or ask, see what else Jesus might ask us. I really think that's a fun practice to consider. Just as we're reading through Scripture, it always helps to have a new frame or a set of lenses to come back to the text and read it afresh. And, I'm like, for example, one would be, have you noticed that 90% of the parables are in a workplace context? So the next time you're engaging with the parables, you might go, I want to think about that. This is to say, well, next time I would read through the Gospels, I could pay attention to when Jesus is asking a question or how he responds to one. And it animates the text a little more. And I just think Scripture is not something that we just read. It is something we read because it reads us. And I really appreciate the hard work you've done on that, JR, to help us engage the text in a different way, to engage Jesus in a different way. It's awesome.
Well, that's thank you for giving that, Ross. I had no idea 90% of the parables were in a workplace environment. Guess what? You have just forced my brain now to, next time I'm reading through the Gospels and the parables are going, ooh, there it is again. So thank you for that gift. That's a fantastic, fantastic lens.
Yeah, well, we can credit our Paul Stevens for that research. Incredible professor who's done a lot on the biblical theology for work. Really, really good. Hey, just a couple last questions. I want listeners to be able to, I'm sure we're all kind of like, where do I start? How do I get better at this? What would be your recommendation? You have several things in the book, but if you were just to say, like, here's one practice you could start with if you want to start asking better questions, what would you recommend?
Yeah. And you're right. There's several exercises in the back, and I tried to make it as ridiculously practical as possible. But the best thing to start with is to keep a questions journal. I think a lot of people say, I'm not good at asking questions. I don't know where to get good questions. And I tell them, you don't have to invent them. You don't have to come up with all of them. They're everywhere. Some of my favorite questions I got off of billboards and podcasts and radio commercials and off a movie and overhearing someone behind me ordering in line at Starbucks. Like they're everywhere. And we will think, I'll remember. No, we won't. You need to write it down. And so I just encourage people, whether it's in a notebook or an index card in your pocket or purse, or even the notes section of your phone, when you hear a good question, just write it down. Just simply write it down. And if our radar is up, looking for and listening for good questions, we're going to hear them. We just have to be intentional. And when there's a good one, I often encourage people to say, now that's a good question. That affirms the question asker. And it also makes you pause for a second and say, wow, that's not one I've heard before, or that's a new one, or, ooh, that's pushing me to think. So the number one thing is have your radar up for questions that are out there in the world. And when you hear a good one that sticks with you, write it down, and then just keep building that list. You can pull that list out and say at a dinner party, hey, I'm trying to get better at asking questions, and I've created a list of 6 or 8 or 15 or 52 different questions. Can I just throw 1 or 2 out? And I'd love to hear what you think about that. It's been amazing how many people have started that list and then tell me, man, I've been able to do that. And it's been really fun to engage in conversation at a party or around dinner with friends. So write it down. Radar up, write it down.
That's awesome. All right, JR, what's one final word of encouragement you might give Christians in their workplace? As you're helping us rethink questions, give us something we can take away and chew on a little bit.
Sure. I'm drawn to Every Good Endeavor, Tim Keller's work, where he talked about no one takes people seriously in the workplace who don't do their jobs excellently. And I've been thinking about that. What does holy excellence mean? As in with the right motive, to do my job with excellence. And so I think the first one I mentioned, like, what is my motive? And then also, by God's grace and God's power, how can I do my job excellently? It's at Colossians 3:23. And whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for others. And I just think if we can do that excellently with the right motive and then trust God with the results, it gets back to your faithfulness emphasis that you mentioned. That's what I would long for every person, including myself, to be able to live into. Excellence with the right motive.
Well, that is excellent, JR. Thank you so much for your time. It's been fun to talk to you about the book and just to challenge us to raise our question asking game. And I think applying that in our workplace is going to help us have a greater imagination for work. And just thanks for being a part of our show today.
Well, thanks, Ross. And I'm so grateful for the great work that you and your team are doing. And it's inspiring people beyond Denver. And I'm really grateful for that. And thanks for even challenging me by asking some good questions here to help me think deeper about work as well.
JR, this has been such a helpful conversation. I'm so glad to have the time with you. Thank you for giving me the chance to read this book. I learned a ton. I hope to be a better question asker. And you've reminded us that asking better questions isn't really just about gaining more information. It's about a deeper connection with those around us, which is something that AI is never going to help us with. More knowledge is never going to help us with. We can always access that, but learning to ask better questions helps us embrace the relationships around us. And that includes in our work. So for you guys listening, try to ask some better questions. Maybe not just like, what do I need to get done today at work? Maybe something more like, what's God inviting me to notice in my work today? Who is my work meant to serve? And how is this work shaping me? Pay attention to those kinds of things, and those different questions will help you notice new things. And we are excited about that because our whole point in this podcast and why we're having these conversations with all the different guests we have is because we want to grow your imagination for work. We think that work is your primary place for being more like Jesus, but also where you get to join him in the work that he's doing. If this episode helped you think a little differently about your work and ask better questions, we'd love for you to share it with somebody that you know, a friend or a coworker, somebody on your team, where you guys can grow together in asking better questions. If you haven't already subscribed to the Faith and Work podcast, we hope you'll do that. Share it with a friend, leave us a review. Thanks so much for listening. May it bless you in your work.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Faith and Work podcast, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. The Faith and Work podcast is produced by Denver Institute. We believe that when Christians work faithfully, the world will taste the hope and life that Jesus provides. To learn more or to make a financial contribution, visit denverinstitute.org.